May 2nd, 1964. Churchill Downs, Louisville, Kentucky. Northern Dancer walked toward the starting gate, carrying more than just a jockey, a saddle, and the hopes of his owner. He was carrying a country. No Canadian-bred horse had ever won the Kentucky Derby before. For almost a century, the Derby had belonged to American racing's biggest farms, richest owners, and most famous bloodlines. It was the race every breeder dreamed of winning, the race that turned horses into legends, and the race that made names last forever. But Canada had never had one of its own stand in the winner's circle at Churchill Downs. Northern Dancer was trying to change that. He did not look like the kind of horse who should make history. He was small, barely over 15 hands, and in a sport that often worshipped size and power that made some people doubt him. He was not a towering giant like Man o' War. He was not a long, striding monster like Secretariat. He was compact, tough, and fiery, with a way of moving that made him look like he was fighting the ground beneath him. But once he started running, the size stopped mattering. The favorite that day was Hillrise, a big California colt who looked the part. Hillrise was tall, strong, and impressive. He was the kind of horse people expected to win the Kentucky Derby. Northern Dancer was different. He had talent. He had speed. He had already won major prep races. But still, to many people watching, he was the small Canadian horse trying to beat the bigger American star. His jockey, Bill Hartack, knew what kind of horse he had beneath him. Northern Dancer was not easy. He could be aggressive. He could be stubborn. He could be intense. But he also had courage. And in the Kentucky Derby, courage matters as much as speed. When the gates opened, Northern Dancer broke sharply and put himself into the race. He was not there to wait in the back and hope for luck. He wanted position. He wanted the fight. Around the first turn, down the backstretch, and into the far turn, the Derby began to take shape. Hillrise was coming. The big favorite was making his move. The horse everyone feared was closing fast. The crowd could feel it. The Derby was turning into exactly the battle people had hoped for. The powerful American colt against the small Canadian-bred fighter. Down the stretch, Northern Dancer took the lead. Hillrise came after him. Stride by stride, the gap shrank. The finish line was getting closer, but so was Hillrise. Northern Dancer was in front, but the favorite was charging. Bill Hartack asked for everything. Northern Dancer gave everything. His legs moved under him with desperate speed. His body was smaller, but his heart did not run small. At the wire, Northern Dancer held on. He won by a neck. The small horse from Canada had won the Kentucky Derby in 2 minutes flat, a track record at the time. He had become the first Canadian-bred horse ever to win the Derby, and in one of the most famous races in the world, he had made his country part of history. But the Derby was only the beginning, because Northern Dancer's story was not just about one race. It was about a horse who looked too small to change the sport, a Canadian champion who nearly swept the Triple Crown, a colt who came home to become a national hero, and a stallion whose bloodline spread across the world so deeply that modern racing still carries his influence. This is the story of Northern Dancer, the small horse who changed racing forever. Northern Dancer was born on May 27, 1961, at Windfields Farm in Oshawa, Ontario. His breeder and owner was Edward Plunkett Taylor, better known as E.P. Taylor, one of the most important figures in Canadian horse racing. Taylor was not just a wealthy owner who wanted a good horse. He was trying to build Canadian racing into something greater. He wanted Canada to produce horses that could compete with the best in the world, not just at home, but on the biggest stages in racing. Windfields Farm became the center of that dream. Northern Dancer was bred from powerful bloodlines. His sire was Nearctic, a Canadian champion. His dam was Natalma, a daughter of Native Dancer, one of the most famous horses of the 1950s. That meant Northern Dancer carried the blood of one of America's most beloved gray champions through his mother's side. On paper, there was greatness in him, but in person, he did not immediately impress everyone. He was small. That became one of the first things people noticed. Northern Dancer did not have the huge frame that buyers often wanted. At yearling sales, size can matter. People imagine big horses becoming powerful runners. Small horses are easier to dismiss. Even when they have good blood, some buyers hesitate because they do not look like the perfect future champion. Northern Dancer was entered in a yearling sale, but he did not meet his reserve price. In other words, nobody paid enough for E.P. Taylor to sell him, so Taylor kept him. That failed sale became one of the luckiest moments in racing history. The horse nobody bought would become the horse everyone wanted to breed to. Northern Dancer was sent to trainer Horatio Luro, a respected horseman known for patience and skill. Luro had trained many good horses, but Northern Dancer would become the defining horse of his career. He understood that the colt had ability, but also that he had a strong personality. Northern Dancer was not a quiet, easy animal. He had fire, he had attitude, he had a temper that needed to be handled, not crushed. Sometimes the same qualities that make a horse difficult also make him great. Northern Dancer wanted to run. He wanted to fight. He did not act like a small horse who needed protection. He acted like he belonged in front of everything else. His first race came in 1963, when he was 2 years old. From the start, he showed promise. He won early, then kept improving. At 2, Northern Dancer won 7 of 9 races. He captured important races in Canada, including the Summer Stakes and Coronation Futurity, and he also won the Remsen Stakes in New York. By the end of the season, he was named Canadian champion 2-year-old colt. But even then, the full story had not arrived. Plenty of horses are good at 2. Not all of them become Derby horses. The Kentucky Derby asks different questions. It asks a horse to stretch his speed, handle pressure, face bigger crowds, travel, mature, and survive one of the most chaotic races in the sport. Northern Dancer had shown he was talented. Now he had to prove he could become something more. In 1964, he began his 3-year-old season with the Kentucky Derby as the dream. He won the Flamingo Stakes in Florida. Then, he won the Florida Derby. Then, he won the Bluegrass Stakes in Kentucky. Each victory made him harder to ignore. The small Canadian colt was not just winning at home anymore. He was beating serious horses in major American prep races. The Derby picture began to change. Northern Dancer was no longer just a good Canadian horse. He was a real Kentucky Derby contender. Still, Hill Rise loomed over the race. Hill Rise was bigger, more imposing, and widely respected. He entered the Derby as the kind of horse people could easily imagine covered in roses. Northern Dancer entered as a horse with speed, toughness, and a country behind him. On May 2nd, 1964, the 2 colts met at Churchill Downs. The race became one of the great Derby finishes. Northern Dancer took command in the stretch, but Hill Rise was coming hard. For a few seconds, the entire dream seemed to hang in the space between 2 horses. If the finish line came a few jumps later, maybe Hill Rise would get there. If Northern Dancer weakened for even one stride, history might disappear. But he did not weaken. He held on by a neck. The final time was 2 minutes flat, breaking the Derby record at the time. The first Canadian-bred Kentucky Derby winner had arrived, and he had done it in record time. For Canada, the victory was enormous. This was not just a horse winning a race in another country. This was proof that a Canadian-bred horse could beat the best in America on the most famous stage. E.P. Taylor's dream had become real. Windfields Farm had produced a Derby winner. Northern Dancer had carried Canadian racing into history. But now the pressure grew. The Preakness was next. 2 weeks after the Kentucky Derby, Northern Dancer went to Pimlico Racecourse in Baltimore. The Preakness is shorter than the Derby, but it comes quickly. Horses who spend too much energy in the Derby can struggle. Horses who barely hold on at Churchill Downs can look vulnerable at Pimlico. Hill Rise was back too, and many people wanted to see whether the Derby result could be reversed. Northern Dancer had to prove the Derby was not a lucky finish. On May 16, 1964, he did exactly that. He won the Preakness by 2 1/4 lengths over Hill Rise. This time, the margin was clearer. The small Canadian horse had beaten the big American rival again. Now, he was 2/3 of the way to the Triple Crown. Kentucky Derby. Preakness Stakes. Only the Belmont remained. The Triple Crown was close enough to feel real. No horse had won it since Citation in 1948. 16 years had passed. Racing was waiting for another sweep. Northern Dancer had the Derby. He had the Preakness. He had the storyline. He had Canada behind him. But the Belmont Stakes is different. It is 1.5 miles, longer than the Derby, longer than the Preakness, and more demanding than anything most 3-year-olds have ever faced. It has ended the dreams of many horses. Speed can win the Derby. Speed and toughness can win the Preakness. But the Belmont asks whether a horse can carry everything farther. For Northern Dancer, the question was serious. Could a small horse with sharp speed handle the long distance? The 1964 Belmont was not even run at Belmont Park. Because of repairs, it was held at Aqueduct Racetrack in New York. A huge crowd came to watch. Northern Dancer entered with the chance to become the first Triple Crown winner in 16 years. But this time, the magic did not finish. Quadrangle won the Belmont. Northern Dancer finished third, about 6 lengths behind. His Triple Crown bid was over. For any horse, that could have been the moment that defined the story as a failure. But Northern Dancer's story was never only about what he did not win. He had already changed Canadian racing forever. He had already won the Kentucky Derby and Preakness. He had already beaten Hill Rise twice. He had already proven that size did not decide greatness. And he still had one more race that mattered deeply to Canada. The Queen's Plate. After the Belmont, Northern Dancer returned to Canada for the Queen's Plate at Woodbine Racetrack in Toronto. The Queen's Plate is Canada's most famous race and one of the oldest continuously run races in North America. For a Canadian-bred horse, it mattered in a way no American race could fully replace. Northern Dancer was already a hero when he came home. About 30,000 fans came to Woodbine to see him. He was not just another favorite. He was their horse, the Derby winner, the Preakness winner, the colt who had taken Canada into the center of American racing. The pressure was enormous, but Northern Dancer handled it. He won the Queen's Plate by 7.5 lengths. This was not a narrow Derby finish. This was a homecoming victory, a celebration, a Canadian champion returning to Canadian soil and proving that he belonged to the country forever. Contemporary coverage described the crowd's excitement and noted that the victory made him the season's leading money winner in North America. That race helped seal his place as a Canadian icon, but his racing career was almost over. Northern Dancer raced only 18 times in total. He won 14, finished second twice, and third twice. His career was short, but brilliant. He was named Canadian Horse of the Year in 1964 and U.S. Champion 3-year-old colt. He had won the Derby, the Preakness, the Queen's Plate, the Florida Derby, the Bluegrass Stakes, and major races as a 2-year-old. Then he was retired. At first, that may have seemed like the end of the main story. It was not. For many horses, retirement is where the legend slowly fades. They leave the track, become memories, and wait for future generations to decide how much they mattered. Northern Dancer did the opposite. He became even more important after he stopped racing. As a stallion, Northern Dancer changed the breed. He first stood at stud at Windfields Farm in Ontario, then later at Windfields Farm in Maryland. Breeders quickly learned that Northern Dancer passed on speed, class, toughness, and brilliance. His foals were not just good. Many became champions. Many became stallions themselves. His influence spread through North America, Europe, and the rest of the racing world. This is where his story becomes bigger than one Derby. Northern Dancer sired Nijinsky, who won the English Triple Crown in 1970. Nijinsky became one of the most famous racehorses in Europe. Northern Dancer also sired the Minstrel, a Derby winner in England, as well as Leifhard, Danzig, and other major horses whose bloodlines shaped racing for generations. Through sons and descendants like Sadler's Wells, Danzig, and Danehill, Northern Dancer's influence became almost impossible to escape in modern thoroughbred pedigrees. That is why the title matters. The small horse who changed racing forever. Because he did not just win races, he changed what future racehorses would be. His stud fees became enormous. At one point, breeding to Northern Dancer became one of the most expensive opportunities in the thoroughbred world. Rich breeders from around the globe wanted access to his bloodline. The same horse who failed to sell as a yearling because people were not willing to pay enough became one of the most valuable stallions on earth. That is one of the greatest twists in racing history. As a yearling, he was too small for some buyers. As a stallion, he was almost priceless. Northern Dancer's descendants filled major races across the world. His blood appeared in winners of the Epsom Derby, the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe, the Breeders' Cup, and countless other major events. In Europe especially, his influence became enormous. Sadler's Wells, one of his most important sons, became one of the greatest sires in history. Danzig created another powerful branch. Danehill spread the line even further into Australia, Europe, and beyond. Modern racing still feels him. Even people who do not know his name have probably watched horses carrying his blood. That is rare. Some racehorses become famous because they win big races. Some stallions become famous because they produce champions. Northern Dancer did both. And he did it while remaining connected to one of the simplest, strongest images in racing, the small horse, who was not supposed to be big enough to change everything. He died on November 16, 1990, in Maryland. He was 29 years old. By then, he was no longer just remembered as Canada's Derby winner. He was recognized as one of the most important thoroughbred stallions of the 20th century. He was inducted into the Canadian Sports Hall of Fame, the Canadian Horse Racing Hall of Fame, and the National Museum of Racing and Hall of Fame in the United States. But his memory is strongest in Canada. At Woodbine Racetrack, a statue honors him. In Ontario, his name still carries pride. He is remembered not just as a racehorse, but as proof that Canadian racing could produce greatness on the world stage. That is what makes Northern Dancer's story so powerful. It has two endings. The first ending came at Churchill Downs in 1964, when he held off Hillrise by a neck and became the first Canadian-bred horse to win the Kentucky Derby. The second ending never really came, because his bloodline kept going. Every generation after him added to the story. Northern Dancer was not the biggest horse. He was not the longest racing champion. He was not a Triple Crown winner. He did not win the Belmont. But greatness is not always about having the cleanest record. Sometimes it is about impact. Sometimes it is about doing something first. Sometimes it is about opening a door that had never been opened before. Northern Dancer opened that door for Canada. Then he opened another one for the entire breed. That is why his Belmont loss did not erase him. He had already done something no Canadian-bred horse had ever done. He had already captured the Kentucky Derby and Preakness. He had already come home and won the Queen's Plate. And after retirement, he became so influential that the sport could not move away from him even if it tried. That kind of legacy is different from a single famous race. Secretariat has the 31-length Belmont. Seabiscuit has the match race with War Admiral. Ruffian has her heartbreaking final story. Far Lap has the Melbourne Cup, the shooting attempt, and the mystery. Frankel has perfection. Northern Dancer has something else. He has a bloodline that changed racing. And that may be the most powerful legacy of all. Because a race lasts only a few minutes, a record can be broken, a title can fade. But when a horse changes the breed, his influence runs every time one of his descendants steps onto a track. That is what Northern Dancer did. He won like a champion. Then he built champions. He took Canadian racing to Churchill Downs, won the Derby by a neck, captured the Preakness, came home to dominate the Queen's Plate, and then became one of the most important stallions the world had ever seen. The small horse became a giant, not because of height, not because of appearance, but because of what he left behind. On May 2, 1964, Hillrise charged at him in the final yards of the Kentucky Derby. For a moment, it looked like the bigger horse might catch him. For a moment, history seemed like it could slip away. But Northern Dancer held on. A neck was enough. A small horse from Canada crossed the line first, and from that moment forward, racing was never quite the same.